This is a story many of you might have heard before. One day, while driving along, Byron J. Carter spots a woman who has stalled her car on the side of the road. Being a gentleman, he gets out and attempts to start the car for the troubled motorist. The year is 1908. The car the lady is driving does not have an electric starter, so the car must be hand cranked. With one hand on the crank and one on the fender for leverage, Byron heaves the car to life. But unknown to him, the spark on the car was left advanced, creating a very dangerous situation for starting. Immediately after the car roars to life, it backfires, sending the crank back into the face of Byron, breaking his jaw. In the coming days, he would succumb to his injuries, and the auto industry would lose a pioneer at the age of 44, a man well respected and a friend of Henry Leland, the head of the Cadillac Motor Company. And in Leland's grief, the electric starter would be commissioned and put into every Cadillac shortly after. But this story likely never happened. While the history of the automobile is a short one, it is still full of folklore and exaggeration. But there is a nugget of truth in this tale. There was a man named Carter who broke his jaw while helping stopped motorists, but the car didn't kick back, he didn't die, and his name was H.O. Carter. Byron J. Carter would pass in 1908, nearly 4 years before the electric starter was invented, and the cause of death was pneumonia, not a cranking injury. So where does this story come from? Well, it comes from Leland and Charles Kettering, who would remember the incident decades after it happened, and their stories would disagree on some significant points, like the age of Byron, and the account would list his death as 1910, despite the fact that he died in 1908, etc., etc. But the embellishment or totally fake backstory doesn't matter, because in 1912, the Cadillac Model 30 would change the auto industry and the world forever with its electric starter. But first, we need to understand what the world for the motorist was like before the electric starter. Well, and in a lot of ways, it was pretty rough. Starting a car could be made difficult and dangerous, and the issue would only become exacerbated by large multi cylinder engines that were coming out at the turn of the century. Inattentive drivers and poorly maintained cars would result in thousands of sprained wrists, broken arms, and thumbs, and even the car running the person over once it started. The issue of broken arms became so common that a new medical term was created to describe the injury. It was known as chauffeur's fracture. Starting cars in cold weather could be a real struggle. Cranking a car over and over by hand would leave people worn out and pissed off, leading to another term called cranky. Driving was off limits for many women of the era too, although some did drive. The heavy crank, dangerous nature, and the dirtiness of it made it very unattractive to women motorists who would prefer electric cars, and the majority of electric cars were sold to women in the early 1900s. And it would be a large selling point of steam cars and electric cars that you wouldn't have to crank them over by hand to start them. And there were attempts at fixing the issues of starting a car by like compressed air, acetylene, springs, and they worked sometimes, but were complex, expensive, unreliable, and didn't see huge adoption. Something needed to be done if the automobile was going to go to the next level. So, folklore or not, Cadillac was fixing a real issue when Henry Leland set out to put the electric starter in his cars. But it wasn't Cadillac that invented the electric starter either. It was a man named Clyde J. Coleman. Coleman was a true genius with dozens of automotive patents to his name, who would invent the electric starter in 1903, but to my knowledge, he never put the system into a production car. So it was Cadillac who brought it to the masses, but it wasn't Cadillac who invented it. To get things started, Wilfred Leland, Henry Leland's son, would call a meeting with his engineers. Resolutely, he would declare that, quote, "The Cadillac car will kill no more men if we can help it. Lay all other projects aside, we are going to develop a foolproof device for starting Cadillac motors." Progress was swift, and it became clear almost immediately that compressed air, springs, and any other form aside from electric was not going to be suitable. Taking Wilfred's experience from a generator battery setup at his estate, the Cadillac engineers were able to create a system of delivering power and a means of charging the starter when not in use. Cadillac engineer would also develop the ring gear at this time, which is still in use today as a means of engaging the starter and engine together. So, pretty soon, we have the whole system sort of laid out, but there's just one problem. Cadillac does not have an electric motor small enough to fit under the hood of the Model 30. To solve that problem, Cadillac would turn to an engineer at the National Cash Register Company, a relatively unknown man at the time, Charles Kettering. During his time with the National Cash Register Company, Kettering would develop a small but powerful electric motor used to open cash registers with special clutches that allowed them to engage and disengage at will. Now, all of the workings are together. The mechanicals are in place, the electricals are in place. All that was left to do was start the damn car. And that day would come on February 27th, 1911, when the starter button was pushed and the car would roar to life. They didn't know it at that moment, but the automobile had changed forever. But at the same time, some people at GM were still really skeptical. So more and more tests were conducted, and funny enough, the crank from the front of the car was removed, and then later pointed out how nobody noticed that the regularly driven car did not have a crank. Once again, showing how reliable the system was. Nobody ever needed to use the crank. The breakthrough of the electric starter was kept a secret for months, but the press began to ask questions. They knew something was brewing at Cadillac, and something big. On August 20th, 1911, Cadillac announced that for the 1912 model year, all Cadillacs would come standard with electric starters. But something else was also going to be on those cars: electric lights. No more fiddling with smelly, inconvenient, and sometimes dangerous acetylene lamps. No, Cadillac would be knitted with a full electric system. Within months of this announcement, the other automakers were falling over each other to offer the same level of convenience as the Cadillac. Some would try to double down on compressed air starters, but it was obvious that the Cadillac system was superior. Soon after, magnetos would fall from favor. Only cars like the eternal Ford Model T would keep them. Electric cars and steam cars would suffer a serious blow as well. The gas car was here to stay and would win the sales race once and for good. Women no longer had to engage with the dirty, difficult starting process and would gravitate towards cheaper, more powerful gas cars. It isn't usually talked about, but the effect that the car had on women's rights cannot be understated. Isolated, bored women now had greater access to the world and would begin to speak up louder as the century progressed. The entire dynamic of the country would begin to change, not only as men would get cars, but as women would get them. And with the electric starter, gas cars were now within the affordable range and were just as convenient as electric cars. Just a few years after the electric starter, the automotive world looked radically different. Almost all cars were self starting. Men, women, and even kids, a lot of times, could drive with ease. A stalled car was no longer a health hazard. The mental and physical barrier to car ownership was gone, and the car would go on to dominate the 20th century. And I really do mean dominate the 20th century. The way that we ate, where we lived, where we vacationed, how we got our produce, everything in the 20th century revolved in some capacity around the automobile. And the automobile's dominance of that century, I believe, and I think a lot of other people believe, came from the electric starter making it so much easier to own a car. The Cadillac Model 30, other than having been built by the quote master of precision, was a pretty standard car. It used a 226 cubic inch four cylinder engine making 25 ish horsepower. It was sold in touring and tonneau body styles, but it was the electrical system here that, even back in the day, was recognized for being revolutionary and game changing. Cadillac would win the Dewar Trophy because of its electrical system, the only company to win it twice. And that's pretty much it. The rest is history. We engage with our electric starters every time we start our car, assuming your electric starter works, that is. But it changed everything. It's made driving a car, it turned it from a hobby to an appliance. It turned it from a sport to just a way of getting around town. All of our cars nowadays rely on the process that Cadillac pioneered back in the day. It changed everything.